Welcome to Conversations on Leadership with Dr. Dave, where we're on a mission to answer 4 questions from the best leaders and leadership minds in the country. And today, we are pleased to have special guest, Skip Worden. Welcome, Skip.
Thank you.
Hey, great to have you. So tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your research. Who are you? What do you do?
Okay, so I'm doing research, writing books. I've written 10 and 5 booklets, and I'm working on 3 or 4 now. And so I'm doing research. I went to Yale, but I'm at Harvard this semester doing the research. So I will try and control myself and not say anything bad about the other school. Although I'd love to.
It's like the Army-Navy rivalry, man. It's like,
yes,
it's an easy pile of poo to step in. I'll be honest.
Let's just say there isn't reciprocality in terms of alumni.
I believe it.
I'll just say that and I'll wink,
Close enough. That'll work for today.
But so I'm coming to you from the basement, the bowels of the main library in Harvard Yard, and so in terms of research, a couple of things I'm doing. I'm looking at the theological and ethical underpinnings of Adam Smith's theory of the market, in particular self-interest as being a bad thing, but having unintended beneficial consequences. Actually comes out of theology, that self-love, a sin, instead of loving God, can have unintended beneficial consequences in terms of charity. So this summer I translated a treatise on that by Pierre Nicole, 1677, who argued that, which is based on Augustine's idea that sin can have unintended beneficial consequences. So I'm working on that, and that's led me to Jonathan Edwards, the theologian, who actually went to Yale, and on the idea of different types of self-love, some being good, some being bad. So that's one project. Another one is I'm kind of taking apart Arthur Rich's book, applying Karl Barth's theology and normative ethical theories to come up with 7 criteria of justice that he applies to economic systems. And he did that in 1985, so it includes the Soviet Union, command and control, and the non-capitalist Chinese economy. Then I'm writing a book on philosophy and film, arguing that film is an excellent medium for that. And I'm writing another book arguing that the domain of religion is sui generis, that it's unique, that it's different than other domains like science, like psychology, even ethics. It's distinct. And my idea is that there's so much non-religious growth in the religion garden that we can't even tell what the native fauna is. That's innate to the phenomenon of religion. So that's what I'm doing. Nothing directly on leadership, but I write essays on the Worden Report, which is online, and I've got about over 1,700 essays, short essays on that. And I've got a section on leadership, and another on religion, another on political economy, where I focus on the European Union and federalism. But I still write essays on leadership, and I'm working on an essay now, in fact, on applying Taoism, the Tao Te Ching to leadership. So I'm working on that short essay, but that's closest I come to leadership in terms of the current interest.
Gotcha. Well, like I said, I saw that was part of the repertoire, but it fascinates me. Tell me a little bit more about the research on the economics, the Smith and the self-interest.
Yeah, Smith was a deist. He was not very religious himself. So we're talking about ideas that were just percolating in the culture, in the society in 18th century Europe. And some of those ideas, theological ideas, were coming off from Calvinism. And so instead of predestination, the idea was that there's free will and that free will can count for something. So self-interest or what you do in self-interest can make a difference. Now, self-interest itself comes from self-love. which was distinguished from loving God. You love yourself instead. So it's a bad thing. It's a sin. And the idea is that self-interest in Adam Smith, in terms of a competitive market, has an unintended beneficial consequence in the efficient allocation of goods and services. That essentially not just the rich get to eat, but poor people get to eat too, because they're making things that the rich want to buy. And so it's just as if God had designed the economy in such a way that everybody gets the same amount of wealth, the same amount of land. And that comes from Bernard Mandeville's fable of the bees, a beehive, where they're all the bees are working according to their self-interest, but they provide for they work for the hive as a whole. It's unintended beneficial consequences. None of the bees are thinking, well, I'm doing this for the good of the hive. And
See, they're not sitting there thinking about the charitable contribution deductions of the greater good, huh?
no, they're just buzzing around. They're just doing their business. In fact, I read a couple of weeks ago that some bees actually stay out of the hive when they're old. They cling to flowers overnight when they're too old, and they feel that they don't want to die in the hive. They don't want to mess up the hive. Well, is that altruism? Well, that's what we impose on the bees. It's not altruism. There's some reason why they don't go back into the hive when they feel like they're gonna die. And so it'd be like for a human being, I'm going to go to the nursing home rather than stay with my kids. When I feel like I'm getting to the end, because I don't want to be a bother to them and die in their house, and they'd have to clean up after and everything. So, in any case, the idea of Mandeville is that the rich people or the landowners are buying trinkets and things like that from the poor, which are basically luxuries and gaudy things and just things that don't really matter. And the idea is that out of that, doing morally objectionable things with luxuries, an unintended beneficial consequence happens in that the poor people who sell the rich the goods, those trinkets, those bawdy things that don't really serve a purpose, and that actually has an unintended beneficial consequence, because the poor people who make those things get paid, and then they can eat. Otherwise, the rich property owners would just retain their capital, and how would the poor eat? They don't have land. So that's the idea behind Adam Smith, that the competitive market actually, even though it's founded on selfishness, it can have unintended beneficial consequences. And this is interesting because it's not coming out of his theory of moral sentiments. Smith said you can't rely on the sentiment of fellow feeling with other people in business.
Right.
You just can't. So this is not the superficial thing of, well, we're going to take Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments and we're going to just apply that to The Wealth of Nations, that book, and say, well, that's the moral envelope that's going to contain greed. No, this is actually saying that greed itself has an unintended beneficial consequence in a competitive market. The problem for us is how many of our markets are competitive. I'd be willing to bet that the meat producers that are now selling beef in the grocery stores are at exorbitant prices. That's not a competitive market. It's highly concentrated, right? And why is nobody talking about antitrust to break them up? Instead, the idea is, well, we'll give consumers more, we'll increase food stamps, we'll give more people money so that they can give more money to those oligopolists, to those producers, and to those grocery stores that are oligopolies. So really, the idea that selfishness has unintended beneficial consequences is quite narrow, and it might not even apply to our world, because how many of our industries are competitive? If they're not competitive, then this whole idea of selfishness having unintended beneficial consequences goes out the window. So for our purposes, and remember, there were no large corporations in 1776 when Adam Smith was, publishing The Wealth of Nations. That's all after him.
Your big corporations back then were like East India Tea Company and
right.
stuff like that. And you're right. It's probably, if if you really think about it, that makes you go one level deeper. You're like, most markets aren't as competitive as they probably should be, to say the least. But it's an interesting segue from agrarian to industrial revolution to more modern manufacturing, that they're not selling trinkets to the rich, but the rich want to produce something, like Ford producing cars, and now you have manufacturing jobs that they're making a lot more money than they were on the farm. You're kind of in a birth of a middle class because, hey, I'm going to make more money because I'm making something versus I'm having to wait till harvest time and hope I can get everything preserved.
So, it's essentially an argument for capitalism, but only if the markets are competitive. And Smith said that there's a role for government in keeping markets or restoring markets to competition. He was not a laissez-faire in terms of government get out of the way. There is a role for government, even in the wealth of nations.
Well, I think that just look at a good sporting analogy. I mean, whether it's a soccer game, football game, baseball game, you've got to have the referees and umpires there to call balls and strike. The rules are there. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have somebody enforcing the rules, everything can go into chaos. But on the other end, you don't want them putting the finger on the scale one side or the other either,
So if we have the richest player in one of the teams paying off the umpire by giving him political contributions, then the umpire is not going to be calling the game well, and we're not going to see antitrust. And so it goes back to, we're not going to see the unintended beneficial consequences of selfishness. And when we don't see that, when we have a monopoly or oligopolies, then the idea is it's still based on selfishness, and yet there's not the unintended beneficial consequences. So we're in a soup. We're really in a soup.
Although one of the things when you were talking about self-interest and self-love, I mean, there is, it'd be classified as a sin, but there's some interest of self-love and self-interest that it's like, I love myself enough to, take care of my health and, maybe take a shower every once in a while. And that has a great unintended consequence for everybody around you,
It's a very good question, especially if we take self-love in the modern sense of psychology. We want that. We don't want people hating themselves. That's not how Pierre Nicole, the French Jansenist priest whom I translated, who argued that self-love can have unintended beneficial consequences. It's not how he's saying it. It's theological. It's not psychological.
Well, I think there's a lot of context and nuance to old writings in today's language. And sometimes I think that they may not get updated and know what they said there, but you know what they meant more importantly. And how does that translate in today's economy, today's philosophy, today's way of doing business, anything like that?
But see, you notice in this, very abstract philosophical ideas are connected to immediate, very practical application. That is suggested antitrust law. Dust off the Sherman Act and get it moving. And the Clayton Act, get those things going again, dust them off.
They were put there for a reason. And like you said, at some point, like I said, when you do always do better with the competitive market, like I said, than only one or two players controlling everything. Yes, the benefit is maybe you have economies of scale. The bad part is it's easier to take advantage because you don't have the competition.
Right. And that's a big problem. And that's something those economies of scale, on the one hand, they weren't realized in Adam Smith's day prior to the Industrial Revolution. On the other hand, they're realized now, but at what cost? The cost is competition. And that's a cost that is eliminating the unintended beneficial consequences of having an economic system that's based on selfishness of buyers and sellers.
True. Then you could have a really fun one-off kind of down the rabbit hole discussion that what keeps prices lower, that true only one or two players in the game, economies of scale, or actual competitiveness, a bunch of players?
Well, I think you could have both. I mean, I understand in some industries you can't, but because of limited resources, but you could have a competitive market that's populated by lots of firms or enough firms to make it competitive, but they're large enough, each of them, to have economies of scale. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. They might in some industries, but I think in most they're probably not. And I think that assumption that they're mutually exclusive is one way in which we skirt around applying antitrust law.
I think you're right, and we'll get into the first question. But like I said, to me, it comes back to context and nuance. It's like it's either A or it's B. It's like most of the time it's some blend of the middle, right? It's not necessarily 100% A or 100% B. There's a little bit of give and take in both of them. There's more of a blend that we want to
Right.
look at.
Well,
Whether
Taoism would say that there's A in B and there's B in A. Yin is in Yang and Yang is in A. That this idea that when we have a worldview in terms of dichotomies or the dialectics that split everything up into opposites, that's corrupted. That's not natural. That's Taoism, basic Taoism.
Yep, I was gonna say there's definitely bad to come with the good and good to come with the bad sometimes. But yeah, I think like I said, it's a lot more some combination thereof. See all the above type of thing to a certain extent. But I wanted to jump into the first question and go into so
Yep.
what does leadership mean to you, and what does good leadership look like?
Okay, so leadership itself, that's a great question. I would argue that it's I began studying leadership in the 1980s, and back then transformational leadership was a buzzword. Uh,
Right.
there weren't any leadership coaches. We were not bringing in other analogies. There were consultants, and there was leadership theory. And James McGregor Burns wrote on transformational leadership, and that was biggie. And Conger wrote on charismatic leadership, and then there were writings on visionary leadership. And so there was a theory, and then the I would argue that the praxis was what we now call upper echelon leadership, was basically what leadership is. Then what the problem is that, and I say that because then managers and management scholars then say, well, we'll just use that term for management. What's really management? Well, what's then the difference? Management is the implementation of a vision. Leadership is setting out a vision, right? Management is the strategy and then the implementation of the strategy. You might be able to say, well, there's strategic leadership in the middle, which is the vision plus the strategy. And hopefully those go together.
Yeah.
But in general, management is not leadership. Leadership is not management. Otherwise, we would just have one word for both of them.
Yeah.
So it's
you had a ton of stuff from Drucker on management long before the McGregor and Burns and all the guys
right.
started really getting prolific on writing literature about leadership theory.
Peter Drucker, right, wrote in 1950s. Yeah, so it was already there. It's marketing. It's the scholars and the practitioners wanting to spiff up the image of management by calling it leadership. It's just, that's essentially marketing. But
well, I like how you put it to where one is here's the vision of where we want to go, what we want to do, and God forbid you would hope there'll be some inkling of strategy and this is the direction we want to go.
Right.
But the management being the execution, the getting stuff done part of it.
Right. Two different skill sets.
Yes, and we were talking about that.
I don't even think leadership is a skill set, although you could say, skills in terms of being able to make speeches. But I think when you have a vision, like Steve Jobs had a vision on how these things could totally change our lives. I mean, I'm old enough that I'm just like amazed that I could have a video phone call through here or even get the internet. I wouldn't even been able to imagine that. And yet it's so much a part of my day. I have it right here. And that vision that he had, I wouldn't call that his skill. I think that was innate to him. I think that just was part of his mind, the way his mind worked. I don't think it was a skill that he picked up. Whereas management is definitely skill oriented. So I would even say leadership is not based on skill, whereas management is. Leadership is more innate, just like Ronald Reagan, people call him charismatic. When he gave a speech, he had charisma. He also would bring an ideology into it as well. But was that a skill? Was charisma his skill? No. It was part of who he was. It was just a manifestation or emergent from his personality. And that personality is not a skill.
No.
So,
we talked about this
too. The management.
Yeah, and I think there's some things on the leadership end that you could work to improve. Let's put it that way. But we talked off air, and I wholeheartedly agree. With the whole scientific management movement in the 20s and the whole positive Gore analogy. You talk about planning, organizing, developing, staffing, budgeting. All of those delegating, all of those things. You can't say, "Oh, this guy's a good leader," and he can't. Like a nonprofit. If he can't maintain a budget and delegate to save his life, I mean, there's not but so many board meetings you're going to go to, and you've blown the budget, and they're going to be like, "Oh my God, this guy's a great leader." That whole management part of it is a skill set and execution on getting things done. But and it's a great point about Reagan, because the first thing I thought about was, maybe to your point, not necessarily particularly a hard, it's certainly not a hard skill to a certain degree, but just the ability to communicate and influence others, the ability to speak in public. That takes a lot of times for most people. Some just jump into it naturally, but it's not an easy skill to learn how to. I'm going to learn how to communicate more effectively with people. I'm going to learn how to influence people. I'm going to learn how to speak in public effectively. I'm going to learn how to use maybe rhetorical hooks to get the audience in and get their attention. I'm going to utilize stories. I'm going to do these more component pieces of. It's not just I'm putting a bunch of words together. There's a method behind the madness of when Reagan came up to give a speech. It comes out the way it is, partially because of the way it's written, partially the way he's honed his craft, I guess is a better way than he's honed the craft of influence and public speaking and persuasion over the years. So when he goes to deliver the well-structured speech with the right stories and the right hooks in there, it makes that resonance with the audience that gets them to buy into the vision. And now let's turn over to the managers to execute and get things done.
Right. You asked what good leadership is. There's two senses of that. And you could say the Aristotelian sense of good in terms of virtue being excellent. Right. Excellent. And I think that's what you're characterizing. Good leadership is first of all, the most important thing is having that innate quality in being able to to see the world in such a way that we see it as an ideal to move towards, that it's not just a replication of the current world. It's an ideal that the vision has coherence to it.
Yes.
That is decisive. That's the important thing to have. If you don't have that, then for Christ's sake, you need to work on the how to give a speech. Don't give a speech. Just go to the management side and get the stuff done. But if you do have the innate leadership qualities to you, then bring up the skills, and then of how to make a speech and making it well. But all those that pales in comparison, skills to the innate, and that isn't the case with skills in management. They're much more central, much more important. So good leadership is both, first of all, in the sense of excellence, not moral, but excellent. Right. Is first of all having that innate, I don't want to say, well, maybe ability, but it's not a learned ability. You either have it or you don't. It's a feature of the personality of the person, emanating, you could say, from the person's psyche or soul. And so that's certainly not a skill. No. And then the skills, just in terms of making speeches and being persuasive argument. I took a speech class when I was an MBA student at Indiana, and so worked on that. But that's secondary. But that's good in that sense. Then there's the good in terms of the moral sense, in terms of moral good. And you could even stretch it to say, how do people bring their faiths in on Monday morning to their vision? And I think the thing to stay away from in terms of religion good is to proselytize. That just doesn't work when you're talking to people who don't have the same religious beliefs as you. This is not an opportunity to convert to your own religious beliefs. You'll be looked at as selfish and imposing if you do that. So I wrote a book on spiritual leadership in business, arguing that just in terms of one's own religious experience, whether prayer or meditation or so on, that having that outside of Monday morning, have it, on the weekend, regular or at night, that will inform one's style of not only leadership, but vision, but also management as well.
I would agree with that. And there's a couple really fine points that I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on, and then we'll end this segment. So, when you talk about the religious end of it, or people having faith, or people having a sense of morality,
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of some of the leadership experts that you hear out there, the Simon Sinek's, and the building up the trust, and the leaders eat last, and just the general sense of taking care of their people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that be a component of good leadership, and like I said, building that culture of trust.
Mm-hmm.
If you, I would imagine, if you didn't have that sense of I genuinely care for people, or I genuinely want to see people succeed, or if it's just I don't care about anybody but myself, I don't care about other people, I'm just using them to get what I want.
Mm-hmm.
It would be very difficult to be what they call an effective leader or a really good leader to a certain degree if you didn't have that moral component of I see you as a person, and whether the CEO or the janitor, everybody puts their pants on one leg at a time, and everybody's a person, and what can I do to build trust with the people in my organization, right? And so that, I think there's some level of that component in there, because if you didn't have that, and you're just like, I give a rip about anybody. I don't care. I'm just here for me, and it's just about me, and doing what I can to make sure I get my bonus, and so on and so forth. Then I don't think you're going to be as effective as a leader, because you're not doing the things to build trust and to really get people to buy into. See, I'd say you as a person, but like you said, it's more than just giving a persuasive speech. I think sometimes it's a matter of, wow, I know that that guy, that gal's got my back if something ever happens, and I'll go to bat for them. I'll walk over hot coals for them because I know they got my back.
Mm-hmm.
That goes a lot to not just the leadership, but also to the management getting things done.
Mm-hmm.
A part of it as well, I think. So that's that genuine caring for people, I think, has a bit of a moral component to it to a certain degree. What do you think?
I think so, and I think it's a good point you're making, that some things apply to both leadership and management. I'm just arguing that they're different phenomena.
Yes.
They're
Oh no, they definitely are.
Don't apply to both of them. And
I'm 100% sold on the fact that management is truly a skill set, and I've seen some people put in those positions who, let's just say, they need to work on that skill set just a bit.
But you know what? Even they on the management side. And I'm on the leadership side. I'm not, even though I've studied management, but still, you walk into a store and an employee who's got an awful attitude, and it's like a really, really bad attitude. Yeah. And you talk to the manager, and they say, "Look, not only did the employee give me incorrect information, but my oh my, did she treat me like crap?" And the supervisor will say, "Oh well, I'll do some coaching," and I'm like, "You can do some coaching on the facts that they got wrong, but I said this to one in Target last month. I said, look, you can't coach, or use an analogy, for
it's hard to coach attitude
change." And I said, look, it just, good luck with that. And it's not just. Management is not just affected by skills, it's affected by psychology as well. And coaching is not, if they're using coaching to mean that they're becoming armchair analysts or counselors, supervisors are way out of their league. And it points back to bad hiring practice, when you're talking about when attitude of employees is the problem. But let's just get rid of this idea that coaching it gets rid of bad attitude. Yeah, you can't take this skill component of management, as big as it is, to be everything about management. Just like vision and leadership is not everything about a leader. Charisma is another, right?
I think you can coach skills and you can coach practice, but like you said, but if you've got somebody with a bad attitude, it's hard to coach attitude. And one thing that I'll throw out there, and then we might pick up on the other side of the segment, is one thing that frontline employees are great at lots of things, but I found out one thing they're really, really bad at, and that is a really poor filtration system, right? So they can't get dumped on all the time by their frontline supervisors, the management. They feel like the company doesn't have their back. We didn't get our cost of living this year. We're running shorthanded to save money. I'm getting screwed. I'm working twice as much. they can't feel like or perceive they're being dumped on, and then turn around, filter that out, and process it, and give you blue skies and puppy dogs at the customer service desk.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't seem to work that way. And I think a lot of folks in frontline supervisory and management don't realize that, hey, if you treat them like gold, they're more likely to treat the customer like gold. You can't bark them all day long and then turn around and expect them to, welcome to so and so. How can I help you, Skip? It's just most employees aren't going to be able to filter that just crap out that they get fed or they get dumped on, and then turn around that into excellent customer service. I don't think that jives.
I think in the management area, the two most pressing epidemics of our time are rude, non-supervisory, bottom-level employees. And then what you're talking about is dysfunctional organizational cultures. Both of those are extremely difficult to extract. And I think it's there's few benefits of getting older, with experience, but now it's easier to recognize a dysfunctional organizational culture.
Yes.
There was a free day of yoga yesterday in a local open house of a yoga company studio, and I went and I asked the employee when they were giving free massages as well, and I did yoga on Saturday and then a free massage yesterday, and I saw they had lunch set up, not quite all unpacked yet. And so I said to the employee after the massage, I said, well, when is the lunch? And she said, maybe. And I said, maybe. And I looked at the yoga instructor, a young guy. He smiled at me, and because we both realized that she was, dissimulating. That's the great word. She was dissimulating. She was deliberately not telling me that. And there's passive aggression in that dissimulation. No, I'm not going to tell you. I'm not even going to answer your question. Because you're, for whatever reason, you're not in the yoga class going on right now, so the lunch isn't for you; it's for them. Even though that's a free class, and you did yoga yesterday. Then I went down the hall and I talked to the supervisor, and I said, "So when is this? I saw stuff set up for lunch, and it's 11:30. When is your lunch?" And she said, "Oh, it's our open house." And I said, "Oh, well, our open house is all day." And she knew I meant lunch, and she's not serving lunch all day. And so again, it was dissimulating and just plain rude. But it told me the fact that two of them had the employee and then the supervisor independently had the same attitude. That's when you start saying, okay, there's a dysfunctional organizational culture that is rude, that is dissimulating, and that's very psychological. Well, getting rid of that or changing that. And by the way, I'm not going back. So how much revenue did they get out of me by saving one serving of lunch? So this is not the way to do business. And yet I argue that employees that deal with the public in retail that have bad attitudes and dysfunctional organizational cultures that are passive aggressive, that don't. This is an epidemic in our times, and I don't think we see it because we just project that it's always been that way. But I don't think it has. And there was a study done in Europe. It's in Euronews on Generation Z and why they're getting fired from jobs. And part of the reason is because they can't keep their mouth shut on their political intolerance, bringing that up in work. They're not getting along with people, and they have issues with authority, with their bosses, So, again, I don't think this is something that's always been going on. But so I think there's two epidemics in businesses, let's just say American businesses and maybe European as well, that business schools are just clueless on. The science of management is not addressing the epidemics, the psychologically based epidemics in terms of human resource management and in terms of organizational culture. And I think the business schools are failing. And then you want to talk about business ethicists who don't even study ethics and psychology. And there's, and then you look at all the ethical, ethical businesses, I mean, it doesn't take Einstein to thoughts on
I'm a
that.
business I'm a business ethicist that has never studied an ethics course. It's like, wow,
I'll
yeah.
tell you on Harvard Yard, and don't tell anybody. This is just between you and me. Okay, you know. Here, let me. Yeah. Skip has left. This is somebody else speaking now, and this has nothing to do with Skip. So but let's just say hypothetically that a business ethicist
Hypothetical.
who teaches at MIT is
Yeah.
in Harvard Yard, and she says she's a business ethics professor, and I said, oh, not me, not Skip. This is somebody else that just came in. So let's say, well, how much ethics classes have you had? Well, none. There sociology and ethics is. I said ethics is not a subfield of sociology. It's of philosophy. To put it academically, in ethics, we deal with ethical theories, ethical principles as rationales for what ought to be. In sociology, they deal with norms, societal norms, organizational norms that aren't ought, there is.
They're not the same.
And you can't get ought out of is. Just like you can't get it out of a melon in a field. You can't get ought out of a melon that's sitting in a field. Right? David Hume is called his naturalistic fallacy. You can't get ought from is. And yet here was a professor of business ethics at one of the best universities in the United States claiming that, oh, yeah, I'm knowledgeable on ethics. I studied sociology. Well, then you look at these epidemics in terms of, we could say it's unethical for there to be a dysfunctional culture because there's passive aggression in it. And it's unethical for employees to be rude to customers. And then you look at why business schools are failing at business ethics. I wrote an article a number of years ago applying Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy to business ethicists and saying, well, basically it's an ideological power play that they're envious of managers, and so they want to tell managers what to do, but they're cloaked within the safety of tenure universities. Well, it's even worse than that. They're not even studying ethics in philosophy. And then they're thinking that ethics is a subfield of sociology, or something else. The emperor has no clothes on. Business schools are failing in terms of business ethics, and it's really means that business schools are failing in terms of management, because two things that I mentioned that are unethical in business: systemic corporate culture, it's dysfunctional, psychologically dysfunctional, and rude employees. This is something that business schools are clueless on.
Yeah.
And
I would say yes, and I would say one thing, and then we'll wrap this segment up. We'll come back to our next segment with the next question.
Yeah, I'll tell Skip to come back.
Cool, and I've got reasons behind it, just some other research, but I am wholeheartedly 100% all in, chips on the board, that all of that, those epidemics, well, maybe the rude employees comes from a fair bit of bad hiring. Let's put it that way. But the dysfunctional corporate culture doesn't help the attitudes. But I think all of that starts at the senior leadership team. It starts at the top. You're gonna fix it. You're gonna fix it. You're gonna run it. It all comes from the top. And I remember two bits of let's just say non-academic research that came out. PricewaterhouseCoopers talked about highly aligned senior leadership teams. Companies that had them are 2.3 times more likely to be high-performing organizations. Okay, great. And then the other one was, I think Willis Towers Watson had something that when the senior leadership team is highly aligned, that their employee engagement could be as high as 72%, but when they're not, basically when the senior leadership team is dysfunctional, employee engagement can be as low as 8%. Well, I'll tell you right now, Skip, like I said, I'll be honest with you. My degree is not in mathematics, but if only 8% are engaged, you got 92% that are not engaged, and that gets expensive. And that is where we think we did a great job at the open house, but we didn't get any new customers. We did everything right. Yes, you went through the right actions, but your dysfunctional culture created a horrible attitude that ran off the people that would have been your customer. So
I went to
do
an,
the right.
by the way, I went to an Indian restaurant after the massage and spent like $16, which is more than I like to spend for lunch. But I was like, screw it. I'm just, I was celebrating the fact I wasn't going to go into that yoga store anymore. That was a matter of celebration. I'm done with that. I just dodged a bullet.
And it's not like you can't find a yoga studio somewhere close
There's
to Harvard
one,
Yard.
2 doors down from there.
You can swing a dead cat and probably hit
I
one.
even wrote a review on Google and I said, there's one right next door. We're 2 doors down.
That
It's just unbelievable how clueless people in management are in terms of how to make money. You'd think that would be obvious. Adam
Yep.
Smith is assuming that sellers want to sell a product and that buyers want to buy the product. But if sellers are so psychologically screwed up that their egos are getting in the way of actually, and they're being penny pinchers, that they're not actually, it's not enlightened self-interest. In a
Right.
seminar on corporate social responsibility, the professor looked at me because I studied also philosophy of religion. He said, well, what do you think enlightened self-interest is in business? And I gave them some lame answer because I really didn't think about it. But, at this point, you might say, well, looking at the long term, and the long term can be defined as beyond today. Like, well, do you want to make money from this person tomorrow? Well, you're going to blow it if you're rude to the person on a technicality.
Exactly. You might make the sale today, but you're not going to get that long term customer, and that's really where your businesses come from. So
And
we're going to.
I'm not going to name any universities, but some of them are making the same mistake. And I'm not saying this because I went to the other school, but in terms of pettiness, in terms of, no, you can't do this. No, you can't do that.
Well,
It's like,
you'd be
well,
surprised how people define what the customer is. Oh, they're students, they're
yes,
professors, they're this, they're that. They're still your customer, and you got to look at it from that customer. Like Drucker said, the purpose of a business is to get a customer and keep a customer.
yes.
And you might get them once, but if you're not nice to them, if you don't treat them properly, if you don't do the right things, you're not going to keep them. And like I said, Drucker said, that's a twofold purpose of a business: get a customer, keep a customer. So with that, we're going to wrap up segment number 1 of Conversations on Leadership with Dr. David. We will be back in just a moment and hit our second segment and question number 2. Welcome back to Conversations on Leadership with Dr. Dave. We are here with Skip Worden from Harvard Business School, and we are going to jump right into our second question. So, Skip, what was one of the biggest leadership challenges you've had to face?
Oh, me personally?
You personally, when you've been involved in, you get a chance to pick. That's the beautiful thing about being interviewed.
Oh boy.
You tell me.
This is the one I didn't prepare for.
Whoops.
Because I'm a writer and it's hard to think. I would say, we lead ourselves. And, you know, um, when I chose not to argue with the MIT business ethicist who feels that she's studied ethics because she studied sociology, I just said, well, that's not my field. And, good luck. That self-discipline to say, I'm not going to bite her head off, you know, is is leadership. And ultimately, I think leadership of other people, and I just sort of maybe supervision of other people in management, uh, has to do with self-discipline, and restraining oneself is very important psychologically. It's not even just a skill. Now, whether that applies to leadership, um, we're talking about a leadership vision, like Steve
Right.
Jobs had this vision of how these things that nobody even imagined could become part of our daily lives. There, I think leading yourself, I guess thinking out loud here, I don't think that that's as relevant because it's the content of the vision that's important there. that it was the content of his vision and the fact that he was able to enunciate it and persuade other people. So maybe in the persuasion of employees and buyers to his vision, that some leading himself in terms of self-discipline and not just simply going by whatever instinctual urge is most has most power at the moment, that's relevant. But I think it's actually much more salient in terms of management, because management has a large part of controlling other people, supervising other people.
Right.
And I guess what I'm getting at is you can't really, can't. I don't think you're good at controlling other people if you're not able or willing to control yourself. Friedrich Nietzsche can be applied here. The purest, best pleasure of power comes not from the battlefield or by conquering other people, but in mastering, not repressing, but mastering your own most pressing instinctual urge, mastering it, not repressing it. Remember,
Right.
Freud said Nietzsche was the bright light of the 19th century. That's what he said, Friedrich Nietzsche. So this is not repressing. This is mastering your instincts. And so I would say for a manager, not a leader, but a manager, that is important, because otherwise, you're not in control of yourself, that in your instincts. And then that's what Nietzsche defined as weakness. And then I wrote an article on this with Nietzsche in the Journal of Business Ethics on
Right.
applying Nietzsche to business ethicists. But here you can apply them to managers and say, if a manager is oriented to controlling other people, but is weak, then that falls into Nietzsche's category of the new bird of prey. The new bird of prey. Those among the weak, the herd animals that have this urge to dominate, and they haven't even mastered that urge, so they can be cruel, right? The person who has self-confidence, who is confident in himself or herself, and is mastered, like quit smoking or mastered chocolate, intake. That person has strength, inner strength, and thus sort of does not need to seek out power, or is not driven to seek out power by being cruel or dominating other people. And that's, I think, a lot of business managers are of the latter, that they are the new birds of prey, that they are getting their fix of power by controlling other people, and just you get micromanagement. Instead, what they're not working on is mastering their own most intractable instinctual urges. And so I would say that for myself, I've been working on trying to master my own intangible or intractable instinctual urges. And I think if I were a manager, which I'm not, I don't have employees, I'm a writer, I would be less of a hound in terms of supervising. And so I think there's problems with the profession of management, that it's susceptible to what Nietzsche called the weak, those among the weak who feel an overriding instinctual urge to dominate is the best way they can get power, rather than from self-confidence and from mastering their own urges that are intractable otherwise.
There's a lot in that. A couple of things I want to get to. One, I wanted to bring in a couple of popular press examples, and then I wanted to kind of drill down maybe on the psychological end of it. But, one of the things that, two things from John Maxwell and some of the books that he's written. One, he talks about the 5 levels of leadership. And level 1 is just positional. And basically, you're standing in between, Joe and his paycheck. Mm-hmm. If you don't do what I say, I can fire you and you don't get your paycheck.
Right.
That's it. That's right. And there's, I think, a lot of folks that you're talking about fall into that category.
I'd say that's management, not leadership.
Right. But exactly. But I mean, that's, you talk about, going up. That, okay, well, I'm telling you to do something. Yes, management. Right. But you're absolutely right. That's where I think the where when people are talking about management versus leadership, you see all the memes that kind of come up there. Here, leaders, here's all the good traits, managers, every bad trait you can think of, which I've seen some really good folks that were managers and were effective and could get stuff done. I
Mhm.
think that whole leader manager thing goes to that first level of leadership, right? The only reason people are listening to you, whether you're a good person or a bad person, is because you're standing in between them and your paycheck. And you had mentioned about mastering yourself, and there's two really interesting things on that. One, Maxwell wrote a whole book about developing the leader within you. And then of course he revised it like 20 years later. But the subsequent book to that was developing the leaders around you. Basically, the implication for me, just looking at the book covers, was, well, I'm not going to be able to, develop team members, develop employees, develop all the managers and leaders if I can't manage my own self, which I feel like goes back to the whole concept of emotional intelligence. Obviously, if you didn't have a high level of emotional intelligence, you'd still been sparring with the MIT professor, right? I mean,
Yeah.
not every hill is the hill you need to die on, right? It's just like, okay, yeah, you do you, boo. And, just like I said, not my field. Have a nice life.
It's funny that the Yale's president, who ended last summer, uh,
Right.
his research field is emotional intelligence. But under his administration, the campus turned into a police state. I mean,
Wow.
it's just unbelievable. I mean, they're everywhere, and not just Yale having its own police force, and not just New Haven having its police force that comes on campus, but then Yale has a whole security department, and they have their own vehicles, and they all have
Yep.
their lights on above, and they'll be parked, occupied on walk paths with 18, 19-year-old students walking by. And I mean, it's just clueless in terms of emotional intelligence to say, oh, well, this is not going to affect students who, walking by a police car or a security guard with the red and blue lights on the top of the car,
Yeah.
in the middle of the afternoon. What do they
It's
think is going to happen? One guy, said, oh, well, somebody got their purse stolen 2 years ago. Well, hello, overreaction and control. See, here's a real good example of the bird of prey, those among the herd animals who can't control their urge to dominate, and they get into positions of power, and then they, you know, then they, you know,
kicks in.
kicks in, and
Yep.
it's turned it into a police state. Now, Harvard has some of that, but it's not as bad, not nearly as bad. Sometimes it's bad, and you can really tell the difference in Harvard Yard between the serene academic environment and then when there's a Harvard police car parked, fully occupied in the yard, in the yard. And this is like, it totally ruins the academic culture. But these people, those employees are not academics. So where are the academics who are in the administration, who are their bosses,
Advisors.
and who are sticking up to the fact that this is a university and not a company? And is it even constitutional for nonprofit or private organizations, whether they're profit or nonprofit, to have their own police forces? The U.S. Constitution gives the police power to the state governments and to the union government. So really, I mean, it's just incredible. It's they shouldn't even exist,
Well,
and yet they're at Yale. They're just saturated. And
yeah. And to your point, almost all of the universities, not all of them, but
yes,
a large majority have gone from having, I've got campus security, totally get, and it's one of those things, you love the fact that there's plenty of them and they're there, but they're unseen. They're not part of the daily experience, right? They're there. You see the little boxes. I can pull the little, if something happens, I can call and pull the boxes. Someone's going to be here like that, right? Because they're on campus. They're not
yeah,
spread around the city having to respond. So it's nice knowing that they don't necessarily have to be in your face all the time.
yes, and
Yeah.
just the control, just the, and I'm reading the Tao Te Ching. They're writing an essay on leadership on it, and it's the opposite of that. It's telling people in government, the rulers, let go. It's like the tighter you grasp Jello in your fist, the more of the Jello is going to go out of your fist. And yet we
Exactly.
keep
Now,
squeezing, and it's like, well, wait a minute, maybe they, and there's a big difference between having, the two or three cop cars plus a few security guys walking around within one block of a campus on a
yeah,
regular basis, and and then that versus having them, like, what was that expression on kids? Seen but not heard. Well, not seen and not heard
there you go. That's
until there's an incident, and then let them swoop in. But to have
correct.
the routinization of emergencyization, that's what it is. It's the routinization of
Mm,
emergencyization,
I like that.
whereby it produces an existential stress. That is to say, it makes people uncomfortable on an everyday basis because what you would expect in an incident or an emergency becomes the status quo. It becomes everywhere. It's ubiquitous, and that is what the Yale campus has become. And
Well, and that's an interesting view of it because you're right. It's kind of like instead of the kids seen not heard, it's kind of like the campus police, campus security there but not seen. Right? You know they're there in an emergency, but that's a really interesting concept about taking what you would expect. Okay, there's a protest, a scheduled protest that goes wrong, people are throwing stuff, getting hurt, whatever. All right, guys, you got to go. We
right,
express your opinion, but we can't have crazy here. We can't have people getting hurt. Not
right,
cool, right? And you can't have people being blocked from being able to get from classes because of whatever you're trying to do. Once again, that throws a monkey wrench in the academic environment when I physically can't get to class because of whatever.
right.
But like you said, you expect to see the cars out, red lights and sirens going, and all everybody out there in an emergency,
Mhm.
but not like you said every day. It does. It really makes a change on the whether it's Harvard Yard, whether it's University of Virginia, whether it's Yale, whatever. Like you said, I like how you put that serene academic environment.
Mhm.
I can walk across campus. There's a level of, and I know this is baked in the cake of just the academic institution in general, but I got this beautiful architecture. I got this beautiful yard. I got, like you said, it's a serene place. I can walk around. I don't have to worry about being safe.
Mhm.
Uh, I said that lends itself to a whole different learning environment. To, like I said, there's cops everywhere, not because they need to be, because there's something going on, but because they are.
Right. And my point also is that by analogy, transference, that kind of thing might be going on in businesses where you have micromanagers, that the micromanagers take on that position based, I would call it management, not leadership,
Right.
um, that is based on just power, just control, and that they use that because, and it's, they say, well, I'm managing a department, but you have to watch out. Are they also enjoying getting pleasure out of the power that comes from controlling other people? And are they able to self-regulate that? That's why I said, in terms of the importance of self-practicing
Yeah,
self-discipline on yourself.
exactly. And that goes directly into emotional intelligence. The two parts, you got part of the self and the part of the others. You got self awareness and self regulation.
Yeah.
Well, are you even aware that that is a problem for you? That you're doing this out of a need to control, and then are you able to regulate that and say, okay, yeah, I want to do that, but I'm gonna, or I can do that, but
Mhm.
I'm gonna tamp that down and regulate that and make it where I'm not going to, like you say, give in to your worst instincts, like you mentioned. Because I think one of the interesting things, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this from the psychological and philosophical and religious standpoint. I remember watching an interview on YouTube with Jordan Peterson. He was talking about the Beatitudes. He was talking about the one where the meek will inherit the earth, and and he got like way deeper in that than I thought. And he was like, well, meek doesn't mean weak. It doesn't mean, he said the original term, it's not talking about weak. It's the potential to be dangerous,
Mhm.
but can control that and has that urge under self control. Because if I can't hurt somebody
Mhm.
and I don't hurt somebody, that doesn't make me a good person because I didn't hurt them.
Mhm.
I couldn't have done it anyway if I wanted to. But if I could have hurt somebody or could have done something bad and chose not to because I
Mhm.
suppressed that because of emotional intelligence, self control, self regulation, however,
Mhm.
that's kind of what they were talking about. A strong horse bridled, I guess, was the was the term that he used, kind of like an original translation. So yes, a strong horse can hurt you, but they're bridled and they're very useful because you're able to ride them, you're able to do whatever, and they're not going to hurt you because of it's that strength tamed. And so I thought that's one of the first things that came to mind when you were talking about being able to use that high level of self control to just kind of tamp that down. And I'm good with myself, and I think people are naturally drawn to that. So I don't need to push my power and authority on somebody because it's like push versus pull. It's an attraction thing. Wow, I see this person who's very self confident, they're charismatic, and they're accomplished, and they're not pushing it on everybody. And so I would love to work for this guy or be a colleague with this person or whatever. It's like I said, almost a pull attraction leaders versus a push. You're going to do what I say because manager. So that was the first thing kind of I thought about when you were mentioning about that. So cool. Well, what do you think one of the biggest mistakes leaders make today? What are your thoughts on that?
Are you, given how I distinguish, and there's an article by, I think it's Smirek and Morgan.
Okay.
From the 80s, I think, where they distinguish management from leadership.
Well, I'm definitely, so there's the,
which one are you in terms of are you thinking?
Well, how about let's start with going with how we define leadership and how you define leadership. What do you think for those the visionary leaders, the ones that are out there? What do you think is one of the biggest mistakes they're making? We might get into the manager end of it later, but let's talk about just from the leadership perspective. What do you think mistakes they're making?
I think, and I wrote a dissertation on this. I think that if the leader's vision is too close to their self-interest and their organization's interest, financial interest, that they suffer a want of credibility. So I think that's one mistake, is tailoring your vision, which is inherently long-term,
right,
to the immediate interest of either your company or if you're president of the United States, your political interests. I'll give you like one example where the UN court came out against Israel for occupying and for destroying Gaza, and more than 1 million people homeless, and killing 42,000, I think it is. And then a few days later, Biden approved arms shipment to Israel, and that undercuts the credibility of international law that says basically don't do that. Well, he was running for president, and he didn't want to piss off the American-Israeli Political Action Committee, or the assumption that Jewish Americans were all supporting Netanyahu and would vehemently reject Biden taking a principled stand in favor of international law.
Right.
So, the idea, the vision that Biden had was, basically we've got Israel's back no matter what. And that it was too close to his political interest in running for president. And you'll notice that Harris also is taking the same position.
Right.
And because they figure, well, the liberal Democrats aren't going to turn around and vote for Trump as a result. So it's a political calculation. So I basically self-serving political calculations at the expense of what visions naturally have, which is principles.
So let me ask you this one, because as a follow-up, so we were talking about jobs before. Yeah. I think I know exactly where you were going with that, but I wanted to ask this to clarify.
Yeah.
You mentioned about a leader making a mistake by making a decision that goes into basically their self-interest over the others, or the company's self-interest. Then you clarified and said short-term. I'm like, all right, got it. And the reason I mentioned it, the two things that came to mind were, well, Jobs had a pretty good, obviously he's like, hey, if we hit it off with this cell phone, Apple's going to be one of the largest companies in the world, i.e. self-interest of the company, right? Is to make this decision to go into this market to create this new item that didn't exist, knowing, hey, we're going to be the first to market and we're going to make this huge amount of money for Apple. Maybe not horrible. And then I'm trying to think of, a big company that's literally as soon as you said short term, I'm like, all right, yeah, I'm on it. Because how many times have corporate board members, CEOs, whatever, made decisions based on quarterly profits?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if I'm going to get my bonus this year, or I have to hit our quarterly profits, and it's all short term, 3 month thinking, it's not long term,
Mm-hmm.
5, 10, 15, 20, 30 year. How are we going to grow this organization? And I, let's stay on the Apple. Somebody mentioned, here's what Apple got to by the time Jobs died, right? And then they said, well, okay, that's cool, but here's what Tim Cook has taken it to. I mean, it's like not even in the same ballpark as far as valuation.
Right.
But yeah, but the first thing I thought of was, Jobs creating the iPad, the iPhone, iPod, all this stuff that's basically creating a completely new technology, first to market advantage type thing, make the company a ton of money. Then I think, no, you're talking more about the short term profits where I've only this net myopic quarterly thinking. Like, what are my quarterly profits be? So when I go to the shareholders, I'm not going to get fussed at, and I still get my bonus. Is that kind of the difference between?
I'd say the way you put it is exactly the traditional way um, in which vision or mission of a company has been distinguished from strategic management in the quarterly earnings, strategic management. And again, from management, from that standpoint, yes, it is oriented to that. And you can't fault them for that. It's telos directed, it's goal directed, and it can be short term. But if you don't want strategic leadership to reduce to strategy, you don't want it just to be strategic. What about on the leadership end of strategic leadership? Think of strategy and leadership. And leadership is the vision. Leadership is closer to the mission of a business than it is to operational details. And that should not collapse into the strategic interest. Otherwise, that vision has no credibility.
Yeah, when that goes into short term quarterly thinking
Yes.
at the highest level, that's when you start to get into bad results.
A vision should not be short term. I think almost by definition, you'd say it's not short term. Stephen Jobs' vision was not even just on his company. He was envisioning a society in which our daily lives would be really changed by these devices, and his vision became real. It's become his vision is now the way the world is. That's extraordinary.
Yeah,
it's really extraordinary. He was a terrible manager. I think he emotional, psychologically, how he treated people, his employees, abysmal. And, so as a manager, but as a visionary, and that's where the leadership area is visionary. And if you have CEOs that just view themselves as managers and not what I'm calling leadership, they're not visionaries. I don't know if Tim Cook is a visionary or not, but I would definitely say that Jobs was more of a visionary than Cook. And I'm not surprised that valuation of the company has gone up over because of Cook, because he's on the management side or the strategy side. But the problem is that what about the vision? And if the vision collapses into the strategic interests, then it suffers a want of credibility. And what I looked at in my dissertation was the impact of religious ethics for people like J.N. Tata, who founded Tata Steel, or Birla, who founded steel in India as well, as part of the Swadeshi movement, which was the Indian self-reliance movement that went hand in hand with independence from Britain.
Right.
Those Zoroastrian and Hindu, respectively, ethics in terms of the vision thing differentiated the vision from strategic management at those companies. And so their visions were credible, and they had a lot of reputational capital that transferred to their companies. In contrast, look at Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, who founded Standard Oil, and he said, "I'm the Christ figure," as he took people out of business and claimed that, well, if you let me buy you up, I'm saving you. So you got images of the Christ figure, and then Standard Oil is the Ark. So he's Noah. He viewed himself as Noah and a Christ figure. He taught Sunday school, for Christ's sake, no pun intended. But here he was saying, I was more of a Christ figure as a monopolist than I was in a philanthropist and giving $400 million away in 1913 money. He said, I'm more of a Christian as a monopolist, as a Noah, saving refiners by forcing them to be bought up. Well, I don't remember John the Baptist in Gospels forcing people, dunking them, grabbing them from the shores and forcing them underwater. And Jesus certainly didn't do that in the Gospels. So I contrast, very self-aggrandizing religious ethical principles that are misused from those of Tata and Birla, Zoroastrian and Hindu. Now, does that mean I'm favoring Zoroastrianism and Hinduism for Christianity? Absolutely not. This is just to say religious ethical principles can be used to distinguish, in terms of credibility and reputational capital, a business leader's vision from his or her strategic interests. That can happen, but don't assume that just because there's a religious ethic involved that the vision is going to be credible. But
right, and not to say that they're not using it incorrectly either. I mean, if you think about, hey, I'm going to claim Christianity to put everybody else out of business,
right?
Maybe
I'm not saying that in strategic leadership that the vision is necessarily going to be separate from the strategy. That there's going to be a tension there between the mission of the business and the vision of society. Think Steve Jobs' vision of society, and the strategic interests more immediate of the company, or even long term. It doesn't necessarily have to. I was criticized for that when the professor said, well, but it's not necessarily the case that there's going to be a tension between the leadership vision and the strategic management. But when there is a tension and you sacrifice the vision to make it collapse into the strategic interest, then something like ethics, ethical principles, whether religious or not, I'm not privileging religion here. It's just was interesting that can make a difference.
Yes, there's been a lot of corporate examples of a company starts out well, and like I said, they get to a certain point where it just devolves into the quarterly profit motive, and it's kind of like, okay, everything we're doing is short term. We don't have any long term thinking anymore, or at least appears that way. It's what do we do for the shareholder?
It rewards that. It's rewarded.
Right. And then of course, yes, there's a pressure from the board and the chair to say, hey, we want our stock to go up. So we want this because, like you said, it is rewarded. But what's the difference between companies that have long-term gain? They're having a long-term vision, like we may eat it in the next couple of quarters, but we're implementing a new system. We're implementing new products. We're redoing our culture to where long-term, we're going to be much better off. I mean, look at, for lack of a better example, what happened to all the companies Jim Collins wrote about in Good to Great?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Oh, sorry. I said, what happened to all the companies that Jim Collins wrote about in the book Good to Great? Most of them didn't stay great. I think they wrote a book, How the Mighty Had Fallen, and I think the number one thing was hubris. Hubris and short-term thinking, and that just turned all this great stuff that he chronicled in his book to, they weren't the behemoths and the powerhouses that they were when he wrote that book.
Well, look at General Electric.
Exactly.
General Electric. And the great Jack Welch.
Yep.
And what happened to General Electric?
Well, IBM. Powerhouse. Talking about hubris, what about Kodak? I mean, they're not even here anymore. And I think they were one of the original inventors of the digital technology.
And you can thank Steve Jobs for that. For Kodak, being antiquated. Society changes, and whether it's from visions or not, the world changes, and companies that that are too short term don't adapt to the changed environment. And Charles Darwin said that species that don't adapt to a changed environment go extinct.
Yep. So from what I understand, Kodak had digital technology for digital picture technology long before Jobs put it into a phone. They just refused to adapt it because they were making way too much money selling film and photo paper to think, okay, long term, this dinosaur is going to die.
Right.
in some term, no matter how much we fuss and moan,
Mm-hmm.
like the buggy whip manufacturer is going to go out of business permanently because of
Right.
Henry Ford.
That's right.
It just is what it is.
I was thinking
So
of another. There was another example that just I was going to say, but it just slipped my mind. Darn it. Um, yeah.
with this,
Sorry.
well, like I said, even look at the. I mean, there's Netflix, there's Kodak, there's all these companies that were dominant, just
Yes.
behemoths, and then they let's say between hubris, short term thinking, and lack of long term. Hey, where the trend's going to go?
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to make a change. Well, cool. Well, you're not going to be a company anymore.
Maybe part of the problem is a company's management defining the company's mission in terms of a product.
Yeah, instead of what they're trying to accomplish to get their vision. So I think that's a great place to end this segment. We will be back in just a moment with segment 3 of Conversations on Leadership with Dr. Dave. We'll get to our last question and we'll wrap up. See you in a few. Welcome back to our final segment of Conversations on Leadership with Dr. Dave. We're here with Skip Warren. And Skip, we're going to jump straight into the last question. And what do you think is the best way for leaders to improve their leadership skills?
Well, you're going to hate this.
That's okay.
But I would
take the question wherever you
say
feel
I disagree with your premise.
Okay.
I don't believe there are leadership skills. I believe the skills that you're referring to are management skills. That I believe that leadership is mostly innate. I don't believe it can be trained. The idea of, think of Ronald Reagan's leadership, and could he ever have been trained? Now, you could argue he was an actor and he was trained in acting, and that some of the charisma that we saw was him acting.
Right.
So that's a legitimate point. But so much of charisma has to do with charismatic literally means gifts of the spirit. So this is something that's integral to a person, and you can't very well train or think of it as a skill, something that's so integral to a person. So I think part of the problem with leadership skills is a very basic one, and getting it wrong, that it's not leadership skills that you're talking about, it's management skills. The problem with doing that is that it ignores what leadership really is, as distinct from management. Say, well, we have great leadership skills at this company. Well, that immediately tells me that they're not focused on leadership, because what they're really talking about is strategic management or supervision skills,
Gotcha.
Coaching people. And leadership is not coaching people. And,
correct.
This idea, by the way, of management through analogies like coaching is pathetic. Any credibility to a field, don't populate it with analogies and pretend like the analogies are real, like they're real terms. It's an analogy. They're not coaches. They're bosses, and they're supervising. And I've said this to some managers when I complain about an employee, and I'll coach the employee, and I'm saying, well, no, you need to supervise the employee. Try that.
Yeah.
And tell the employee what to do. That's not coaching.
Yeah.
And so I think the problem is that when these people say leadership skills, they're already handicapping themselves. They're cutting off leadership vision, charismatic leadership, the idea of vision, which is closer to a company's mission than it is to strategic leadership. And if it's not, if it collapses into strategic leadership, then the vision is not credible. Then it's just simply a manifestation of self-interest. Leaders' own or the organizations?
Interesting. Well, and I don't necessarily disagree with that, because like I said, you've got you talk about managerial skills. There's a lot of skills that are just the getting things done. And like I said, and I do believe that to a certain degree, don't take this the wrong way, especially listeners, and I'll explain. It's funny you talk about Ronald Reagan being an actor, and that was part of it. But to a certain degree, let's just say you've got a company of 5,000 people and you've got an all hands on deck meeting. Are you going to present or speak the same way.
Right.
When your management team is sitting around a 12-person conference table that you guys meet every week,
Mhm.
and you've kind of built this casual, informal relationship that, yeah, you're the boss, but so on and so forth. You're not going to speak to them the same
Mhm.
as you are getting up and doing a presentation or a speech in front of a 5,000
Right.
all hands on deck meeting.
Right.
So call it an act if you want,
Right.
but there's different ways to present yourself in different situations. And I would definitely say you got to bring it when it comes to, and you got to deliver certain public speaking skills.
Right. Absolutely. And I agree with you. There are those skills, and those skills I would say are leadership skills. But I don't think companies mean those skills when they're saying leadership skills. I think they're thinking supervision or policy skills with implementing policies, management. But I totally agree with you. And I was thinking of Steve Jobs, or you could think of Bill Gates, or you could think of Zuckerberg, and how they address when they speak to their employees, and
Yeah.
the way they're packaged, the way they're selling, or they're presenting a new product even. But I think with Jobs, I wouldn't be surprised if his talks to all of his employees in a large auditorium didn't go beyond the product to talk about the world that he was imagining. And
Correct.
so absolutely, I agree with you that there are skills, but those are skills that are different than I think what companies mean by managerial skills or management skills, what they're calling leadership skills.
Well, how about this? I'll push back a hair and say, well, what if you had to wave a magic wand and said, just like you said, that is a leader's what Jobs could get up there and do,
Mm-hmm.
and he was every time he did a product presentation, I mean, that was a master class of presentation.
Right.
From the way he had the PowerPoint images, as far as just
right
everything. It was a master class on this is how to do it.
And
right?
that's leadership skill.
Right. Well, what other of those, what would you consider those essential leadership skills that truly fed into your concept of what leadership is?
What leadership is. And again, I'm following Schmierich and Morgan, their article, and I can't remember what journal it's in, but I think it's on management versus leadership that sets this out. I didn't invent this. I think in terms of the content of the vision. See, once you get the leadership skills that are really management skills out of the way,
right?
What you're doing, and it's really excellent what you're doing. You're saying, okay, what about these skills that are oriented to leadership vision? Then the skills of presentation are even secondary to, sort of like in Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. If you have a really good vision, then the presentation, makes less of a difference, is less important. So bringing in principles to your vision, and not just simply having your vision be a product, but connecting it to a vision of society that is not just a reflection of a strategic management stakeholder framework where the firm is in the middle and the stakeholders go out like a wheel,
right?
But a web where the firm is out of the middle and then there's a web. That's a societal template or paradigm. And that's the paradigm that a leader should have as a basis, the vision. This is not strategic management, where you do want the firm to be in the middle and stakeholders to go out in those bilateral relationships. Now, this is society, which has a web-like structure where the firm is not in the middle of society, right? And that's the framework to use. So that's one thing to do. And then to include in the content of your vision, what you're describing, the picture you're painting for people, it's principles. And it can be ethical principles, ideological principles, like freedom, or no harm, which is an ethical principle. There'll be less harm in society. There'll be more freedom in society. This thing has really helped with freedom. We're not tethered to a wall when we're making telephone calls anymore.
Amen.
You know, and undoing. I remember as a kid undoing the snarls cord. You know, which, um, but having principles, and I don't mean business principles. I mean um, ethical, but not just ethical. Could be if you're a religious organization, it could be theological principles. If you're a Christian church, it could be principles of Christian ethics that are in the vision. That it isn't just simply maximizing donations. I want to live in a world where this church has more donations. That's not a vision. You know,
Very true.
so principle make it interesting. In other words, not reducing it to financials, not reducing to my self-interest as a leader, not reducing to my company or my organization's self-interest, but to a better world. Even as a president of the United States, the vision being for the world is not just simply what's in the U.S.'s national interest. It won't have any credibility abroad if that's it. And you want some sort of political principles embedded in the meaning in the vision. So you want values, you want meaning, like a story. You can even use a story, a narrative, to portray the vision. Meaning and value are the constituents just as much as finance, even more. And that's why I say the vision is closer to an organizational mission than to the strategy plan.
I would agree with that. And one thing you mentioned, one particular word that I really like, you talked about story. And some of the best communicators I've ever seen, whether it's Jobs, whether it's Reagan, whether it's whatever. Matter of fact, there's a book called The Power of Story. I mean, it's a lot of folks have jumped on the bandwagon, and it's really true. There's been a lot of just the narrative of storytelling throughout human civilization. If you can really tap into that, it's not just data and abstractions. It's how can I take maybe the data and abstractions and weave it into a story that really can pull people in emotionally. And love to get your thoughts on this. But when you're talking about an inspirational leader like that, that's really putting out a vision of what could be, I think if they can buy into you and a person as a person, and they can buy into, yes, I want to see the same thing accomplished in the world or in society or in this company, or hey, I buy into the vision that you're selling for the company, and I buy into you as a person, as a leader, as a whatever you want to call it. I think those two are like incredibly powerful to be able to bring people in and get them, energized, enthused, engaged, and really get them to perform their best. Because, like I said, if you can have the best vision in the world and they think you're a, POS, I mean, you're like, I'm not dealing with this guy. I mean, I love the vision, I love where they're going, but this guy's a snake, right?
Right.
Or yeah. And I'm not talking snake like Jobs where, okay, hey, I'm not a great manager,
right.
Personality might be the greatest, but like I'm really out to get other people kind of snake.
Right. See, now you're beginning to follow Smirchit and more. I can never pronounce his name, and Morgan is one of them. Smirch, in terms of, I think it's really useful to think of this. And one consequence of that is that if CEOs and boards start thinking this way, then they might say to their CEO, okay, we want to develop you as a leader. And we don't, and not just its skills, but we want to find a CEO, first of all, that has the innate leadership qualities. And we want to make training available so that that leader has skills to persuade, to speak. And most importantly, we want to know what that leader's vision is. That is not a reflection of the leader. And then also, whether for good or bad, like you said, people, when they want to attack a leader's vision, they go ad hominem after the leader himself or herself. So you don't want to, pick somebody who's, has a sordid, set of.
You don't want to give them any ammo. Let's put it this way: you don't want to give them any ammunition to be able to come after the leader in order to shoot down the vision.
That's right. And we see this in national politics all the time. I mean, this is just the campaign now is saturated with this. somebody's a fascist or I mean, the words that are being thrown around, I've already voted, so I can ignore all of it. But it's
Yeah.
just amazing to me, the words. And I don't think I don't think this is a new thing. I mean, I think if you read what was said about Lincoln or what was said about Douglas, or Jefferson, what Jefferson was.
I was getting ready to say I worked in Charlottesville for a number of years, and my wife worked at the hospital at UVA.
Uh-huh.
And they think the last 50 years were indicative of the last 250.
Right.
And it's like, yes, things may have been fairly civil from Nixon on to a certain degree,
Mm-hmm.
right after Nixon resigned. But man, go back to Jefferson and Adams. My God,
Yeah.
you talk about we ain't seen much slinging like them cats.
Mm-hmm.
Those guys were brutal. I mean, we don't get fist fights on the House floor anymore, right? Nobody beats somebody in the Senate with a cane and kills them.
Which they did in the 1850s, right? It was about.
Right. I mean, we don't see that kind of, well, the discourse is uncivil. Yeah, it sucks, and I wish it wasn't like this and people at each other's throat. And I love SHRM as a national organization. Their whole thing this year, the whole thing the last couple of years has been trying to foster 1 million civil conversations, especially in the workplace. And I'm like, yes, from your lips to God's ears, man, because we need a lot more. I can get along with you. I don't care who you voted for. It doesn't matter. We're here to do a job. We're here to create the vision of the company that we see that we both bought into, or at least it pays our paychecks and does our stuff. But yeah, I just had this in my mind. It got to buy into you as a leader, as a CEO. They got to buy into you as a leader, and they got to buy into the vision of the company. And obviously, if you're not totally bought in, then you trying to sell a vision of something you don't believe in is inauthentic. And I don't know about what your thoughts on it are, but I think now in the age of social media, people have a pretty highly attuned BS meter. And they can tell that guy is not authentic. And that guy is. I think it comes across, even if they don't like what you're saying, they know that, hey, that guy is, at least he's real and he's authentic, and this person isn't. And when you're I worked enough places where you could tell the corporate speak just oozing out of their mouth, and they said the right words, but you just knew, like, it's not coming from the guy that I
think
really
it's gotten worse. I think corporate speak has gotten more egregious, more fake, more artificial, and that people are just saying no. And I don't think it's that people have just had enough of it. I think it's getting worse. And that corporate
I would agree with you.
Is just out of hand.
I think it is getting worse. And the thing is it's almost like the natural remedy or the antidote to a certain degree for that is just authenticity.
Right.
I truly believe what I say. I mean, that's a good way to put it. The antidote for corporate speak is being authentic.
And we want leaders who are authentic. So I think,
yes,
in the idea that a CEO should be both manager and a leader, I think is a problem, because I don't think you're going to find many people that, and I think actually the one who's more oriented in bean counting or finance is not the one that's going to have vision. And
I think you could.
I think they should separate the two.
Of the three things you could have, let's just say you have the entrepreneurial visionary. Let's just say you have the manager. Right. And I'm saying that in a very loose term as far as be able to relate and deal with people, right?
Right.
And be able to get things done through people. Right. And then the third leg of the stool would be, okay, I've got the hardcore high C analytical number cruncher guy who's just a brilliant with numbers. Just don't get him around. He may or may not be good with people. I'm oversimplifying it, but don't get him around to people, like, because the people aren't his thing, and he, it's not as much as the vision as much as the numbers. So if you got the people, you got the visionary, and you got the numbers guy, right, you got a pretty strong team if you've got those three legs of the stool.
And there are corporations have offices that they can use. I mean, the corporate president is an office that is like an appendix to a person. A corporate, you're the president of a corporation. What the hell do you do? Right. And then it's like, okay, we all look to the CEO, but what if there wasn't a CEO? What if Steve Jobs was the president of Apple and Tim Cook was the COO, the chief operating officer, and Jobs was, giving the auditorium talks, pep talks, talking with stakeholders, and then leaving all of the how-tos to cook and not getting in that room and fighting with employees,
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
or getting
Well, and that's
supervision. Separate the two in terms of offices, and a president preside is supposed to be a vision
yeah,
oriented, not partisan
yeah,
on
right.
politics, and
Yeah.
it's also, like, I would argue, not managerial.
Well, I would agree with that 100%. And it's funny because you mentioned about Gates earlier, and I thought it was a great example. I've used it in a couple presentations that I do. You've got like Jobs, Wozniak, right, that were co-founders, and they kind of came up together. They were, had different talents and abilities.
Mhm.
But then you ended up having Gates, and you had Steve Ballmer. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, one, I know they weren't co-founders. I think Ballmer was like Gates's 34th or 32nd employee.
Hmm.
So he had grown probably to the point where, if I've got a little over 30 employees and I like managing people and systems and processes is not my skill set. The computer stuff is my skill set. The vision of what I'd like to see Microsoft to be is a skill set, but doing the people management and the systemic operation is not.
Mhm.
I just thought it was interesting how you see them two together, like you see Jobs at Wozniak, but he was like hire number 32 or hire number 34. And I mean, eventually was the CEO, but he realized, hey, I've got this weakness. This isn't my jam. I need to, I think good leaders realize I'm not a numbers person. I need somebody who can give me the numbers and is a brilliant
Right.
analyst with this stuff.
I'm
I
not,
need someone who could run the operation and
right.
do the managerial end of it. I need to bring them in and surround myself with people that complement my skill set as the visionary leader, not trying to, let's say, do it all myself.
Yeah, I think strategic management might be a problem in itself. The idea of strategic and management being in the same person might be a problem.
Yeah. I think definitely the strategy should be as close to the top, the leadership is end of it, and then the management end of it is the how do
Right.
we implement, execute, and get
Right.
the strategy done.
Right. Right.
Here's they've already laid out the path. This is the hill we need to conquer, and they've kind of given us some bumpers on the bowling alley. So now our job is within our limits that we have and our budgetary restraints or whatever to go forth and conquer, go and fulfill the mission, do what we're here to do
Mm-hmm.
in the best way we possibly can. And we're not putting long term over short term to the point where, oh my God, we overspent. Now all of a sudden we don't have
Right.
a company. But on the other hand, they're keeping that long term vision and goal and say, okay, this is where we're going to get to. We're going to, like you said, to Jobs' vision, we're going to change the world with these little things, and it's just going to, technology is going to completely revolutionize the way we live life. And I don't think anybody would have thought of that in 1984 when they when the iconic Macintosh ad came out with the lady threw the hammer and smashed the screen. I don't think people had any clue. I think he had that vision that it's just going to change, and just going down there, that the vision is this technology is going to change how people live, and to get from that ad in 1984 all the way to what we have today is absolutely unbelievable.
I kind of do something like that in terms of my writings in political theory on federalism are argue that the European Union is like the United States, that it's a federal system, that governmental sovereignty is split between the EU, the federal level, and the state governments in the EU, and that the states of the EU, like France and Germany and Denmark, are equivalent to our states. In both cases, they're semi-sovereign. Their states, the EU states, and our states are semi-sovereign. And both the EU and US at the federal level have delegated, enumerated powers. So I think that the EU and US are equivalent, and that's sort of, you could say, well, okay, in terms of leadership, I'm sort of putting out a vision which challenges. Larry Summers here at Harvard told me that he thinks I'm the only one who's making this argument, and it sure feels like that, because I'd be surprised, if anybody's reading these essays or books.
What you're talking about structurally, the EU and the
Yeah, I think the EU and the US
US.
is equivalent. They're both empire scale federal systems, and so I think our states were. I wrote a book called British Colonies Forge an American Empire, and I argue that our colonies were replicating the European early modern nation states, like a Greek colony replicating the city state on the same level. So you know, France and then Virginia, not that Virginia would be a part of England, but it was, you know, and the British Empire had Virginia and Ireland on the same level. Virginia and
Right.
Ireland were on the same level, both members of the British Empire. So I argue that if they're both on the same level, then the EU and US are on the same level. Well, Europeans just hate this because they've gotten away with taking us Americans to lunch for forever in terms of our entire union is equivalent to one of their EU states. And,
Yeah.
you know, so vision is, I've got this vision thing that, you know, and I do talk to people about this. I was out west this summer, California, and I would get into conversations with European tourists and you know, like completely different vision. And you know, they'd say, "Well, how is it in America?" I'd say, "Well, I don't know. You know, where I'm from in Illinois, it's like this." And then, how is it in Europe? Oh, I don't know. I only know what it's like in France. Well, okay, wait a minute. You see apples, apples, oranges to oranges. But they hate
Well,
that because they've been getting away with saying that their state is equivalent to our entire union, a whole empire of 50
right.
republics.
Well, and I think, and here's where I think I could say that, okay, there's a lot of validity to where you're going and what you're expressing, because from a purely, I'm looking at the structures, like I'm looking at an organizational chart. We'll take it
Right,
back to business and leadership. If I'm looking at an org chart, oversimplified, but I'm looking at the structure. Yes, you're absolutely right. You got the EU is set up as a federalist system, federalist type of system. And if I'm not mistaken, one of the reasons that they decided to do that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, if first thing that pops in my head was economic power.
right.
Okay, we know France on its own, we know UK on its own, Spain on its own, Italy on its own. No way economically could compete against the United States.
Right.
Ain't happening. But as a collective,
Mm-hmm.
roughly similar GDPs ish, or at least getting into the ballpark
Mm-hmm. Yep.
between collectively everybody in Europe, we can compete, you know, as a powerhouse. Plus, obviously, it made some other things that are more akin to what you're saying. Like, I don't have to get a permit and I have to have a passport to go 10 miles down the road and go into Maryland and
Right.
keep going another 15 miles and be into Pennsylvania, right? Or go over here and be into West Virginia. I don't need a passport for that. Where the nice part about the EU is it dissolved. If you're a member of an EU state, you could freely travel.
Right.
And so it did bring the free travel. It did bring the, now how it came about and the why it came about, a little bit different. I mean, you could certainly philosophically argue that all day long. But I think from a technical standpoint, as far as free movement, free trade amongst this, no, there's no tariffs in between Virginia and North Carolina. Right? It just is not, right? And as much as Virginia, West Virginia may still throw jabs at each other, you don't have to pay a toll at the at the
Right.
state line to bring your goods in, right? So that's very similar to the way the EU is set up, right? There's a lot free trade, free travel, and just having that collective economic power to that. But yes, it's definitely from a structural standpoint, you know, let Larry know. I would argue that it's very identical. Notice it now. How and the why behind it. Oh yeah, you certainly that's going to rattle people's cages on this versus that, sovereign state versus the collective. You know, obviously UK got out for their own reasons, right? And it makes a lot of sense, especially with them not being, you know, contiguously connected to the rest of Europe. I mean, okay, I can understand the argument both ways, but yeah, from a structural standpoint, I would say yeah, you're right on point as far as federalism. But yeah, like I said, how it came about, maybe a little different.
Yes. It's so what I'm basically saying is that what's fundamental to a vision, business, government, religion, whatever, is a certain um, paradigm, a certain framework.
Mm.
And in this case, it's, you know, the EU and US are at this level, and the EU states and our states are at this level. This is a paradigm viewing this
Yep.
and this instead of this and this are
Right.
together.
Well, you
That's
right. Well, you could
paradigm.
to your point. You're absolutely right. Take the GDP of a lot of our larger states. They're way bigger.
Oh yeah.
For God's sake, California is bigger than most
Yeah.
EU's individual
I think
states.
it's
There,
the fifth or
Texas.
sixth largest in the world.
In the world. So you take California, Texas, New York, some of the bigger states, and you compare them to some of the uh, even Virginia, but take the GDP and compare it over to some of the European states, and it's definitely got them equal to dwarfed, depending on who you're comparing with. So, yeah, as far as that goes, you're right. It is kind of apples and apples
I
as
would
far as
even
what you.
say that when a company wants to have a leader is president, that the president role is more philosophical, more of a philosopher, more of a thinker.
Yes.
Not only do you want meaning made up of beliefs and values, but you want to think about consciously what paradigm is the basis for your vision. And by this, I don't mean the difference between the web and the stakeholder framework. That's
Right.
a given. But then I'm talking about the framework that has to do with that's the basis for the content of the particular content of the vision. In this case, the EU and the US are equivalent and their states are equivalent. And then once I've got that paradigm down, I can give talks about how the EU can learn from the US and vice versa, because we've got apples to apples, oranges to oranges. You'd be amazed at the comparisons that can be made. Well, same way in business, you have a president, corporate president, who's not in management, so focusing on this and thinking should involve making explicit, at least to the leader himself or herself, what is the paradigm of the subject matter of the vision that itself then assumes a web-like structure rather than a stakeholder hub wheel structure. So there's multiple levels. So there's plenty of thinking, and that's why I say maybe corporations need philosophers to be presidents, not financiers, to be leaders. It's really
That's your right hand.
type of person. And when you get into it and you stop, if people stop calling leadership skills and what are really management skills, and then we start talking like you did an excellent job. You totally focused on, okay, so what are the leadership skills in terms of vision? And all of a sudden, they're blossoming. All of a sudden, we're getting, oh my God, he's talking about meaning. He's talking about values. He's talking about paradigms. He's talking about principles, ethical principles, political principles, economic principles, competition, that's a principle. So,
Yes.
Economic liberty. So, a lot of work, a lot of thinking goes into that, and then making sure that the vision is not just simply a reflection of your self-interest or your company's self-interest. So that's why I mentioned this thing about the basic paradigm of the EU and US to speak explicit to you, to show the importance of a paradigm level that I don't think business leaders think about.
Probably not. And I said, I like that idea of really focusing in on what that chief executive, president, CEO, whatever, that chief executive person who's responsible, one, to answer to a board, but two, which is a unique thing on its own, but two, having that sole responsibility to be able to take the vision of the company and the vision of the board, be able to sell it to the stakeholders, sell it to the employees, sell it to the customers, and just the world in general. Having to put that out there really, like I said, you're right. That's their number one. That's why they're there. They're there to, here's our vision and here's how, and not necessarily here's how we're going to get there, but here's our vision and here's our beliefs and here's our values, and really push that, and then have that strong COO, have that strong CFO that are right there with them to kind of complete almost like that virtuous triangle. Like if you got the person with the vision in charge, and you've got the great operations people guy, and you've got the great finance person, man, you've got everything ticking on all eight at that point, and then I think you can really accomplish some great things.
In terms of a chart, I think I would have the CFO under the COO, I'd have the COO directly under the board, the chairman of the board, and I'd have the president directly under the board. So the relationship with the COO and the president, and how we've been, their functions, their skills are qualitatively different, meaning different in kind, not just degree, management and strategic management, and then leadership vision. So they really should not have much direct conflict. And where strategic management comes into play in relating these two is at the board level. And then it becomes very important of duality. I remember Armstrong of AT&T. I asked him once at Yale when I was a student there. I said, you're president, you're chairman of the board, and you're CEO. Isn't that a conflict of interest? And he goes, well, I have, the buck stops here. That's what he said. The buck has to stop here. This is, he was at AT&T. This would have been in the 1990s, and the dean wasn't that happy.
I bet not.
With me asking that question. Unfortunately, I was not in the business school, and I'll mention I'm not in the business school here at Harvard. I'm in liberal arts, where I've been relegated to the library. Have trouble even getting in the cafeteria because, at any rate, so I would say really presidency, dust that off and invigorate that office, and then separate it from either call it the COO or the CEO. The chief executive does not include, leadership. So you'd have the president and the CEO or COO, right, at the same level, responsible for different things, and the board of directors is what would then relate, but not conflate leadership vision with strategic interest.
Interesting. Now, it's an interesting idea. I'm going to noodle on that for a while because, like I said, at first I was like, okay, the CFO coming underneath the COO, I can get 100% because it falls into execution and operations. But then, having the CEO and the COO both being kind of at a similar level, and then both answering to the board separately,
and the board not being bought off by one of those two or both of those two.
That was really
the problem with AT&T, right?
You would need a strong board to do that. And you're right about the conflict. What the thing that gets me is the whole point of having a separate board is whether you're a city manager and you're, I'm answering to the city council, or I'm a CEO and I'm answering to the board of directors. I have a separate, completely, nonpartisan board. I've got to have a board of directors that has nothing to do with me. I answer to them. I work at their pleasure. They could fire me at any time, although I got a pretty sweet contract. So if they do fire me, I'm getting paid, but they can technically fire me at any time, right? So it's that conflict. Is it worth paying out the contract to get rid of them? But we can get rid of them in a moment's notice, having that kind of tension. But you're the chairman and you're the CEO. Is kind of like, well, I'm answering to myself.
Right.
It's fine when you're the owner and you're not a stock corporation. Right. And I'm the 100% owner, or 51%, 50% plus one owner. Right. I can wrap my head around, I'm chairman and I'm CEO. Got it. You got the majority stake. You own the business.
But what do you think then about, what do you think of minority rights, minority stockholder rights when that's the case?
Well, I'm still not thrilled about it because I think you need that outside objective perspective of a board that's separate from you. I mean, it depends on the size of the company.
Well, I mean, the board would be separate. But what about those, if you have somebody who has so much stock, maybe like Zuckerberg and Facebook or Meta, what about the stockholders? What about the stockholders that are in the minority? Not in terms of the board. But
no, I know what you're saying. What I'm thinking is the board is basically, they're there to advocate for the position of all the stockholders. And I don't even remember if Facebook, if Zuckerberg was 51% or not, or if he's still majority. I know he's got the biggest amount of stock, but I don't remember if it's like 50% plus one or whatever. Yeah. But you're right. I think that's the whole purpose of the board, is to not just cater to
the largest,
the the largest stockholder. It's like, and I know there's some influence if somebody owns more than 50% is a significant amount, but they're there for all the stockholders. Their fiduciary responsibility isn't outlined to the biggest stockholder. Their fiduciary responsibility as a board is to all their stockholders. And so I think that if you own 52% of the company and I owned like 24%, and somebody else owned the rest, and basically they did everything you said and I got screwed over, I think I could make a pretty good case for you're not, this is blatantly, you're not looking out for your fiduciary responsibility to all the stockholders. You're looking out for your buddy, your drunken buddy you go out on the boat with, that owns, majority of the stock. So I think that just that legal fiduciary responsibility is a wonderful thing built into our system to try to help protect the rights of the minority stockholders from the one. And honestly, the smaller the organization, the harder that's going to be. Mm-hmm. When you start getting to publicly traded, the regulatory burden and what you have to do just explodes exponentially. But there's reasons behind it, and for the reason you said is a good reason why you would do that, is because you want those public filings, you want those things to be there because it's a publicly traded stock, and people want to have faith in the fact that they're not going to get screwed over by buying publicly traded stock because of whatever, nepotism, favoritism, whatever you want to call it. Their rights are protected. So no, I'm with that 100%. It's just hard for private non-stock companies. If I own the majority share, it's kind of, sometimes there's not much you can do about that, unfortunately.
So I think actually corporate boards should not have members of the upper management on them. I think they should all be outside. And you might say, well, that you need management experience and knowledge of the management of the company on the board. But I would say that makes the board too susceptible to being dominated by the CEO.
Let me throw my argument in there and see what you think. Mm-hmm. I'm all for it as long as they're non-voting ad hoc members.
Oh, the management team? They're on the board?
My God, yeah, please have the CEO on the board. But there's times you have lots of boards that have non-voting
management
advisory capacity members.
That's fine. Yeah.
You want them. Yeah, you want them there in the meetings, but they're not actively voting on because you answer to them.
Right. So I also think that one part of the rationale for distinguishing this president in terms of leadership from the CEO or COO in terms of management is that companies, they're really technically designed to fulfill public purposes. They get chartered by governments, a lot of them by Delaware, but it's a government that charters a corporation to say, delegating a public purpose. Say, okay, you make these or you do this function. But just the fact that there's a charter means that it is a public function. So there is a legal, a sort of a meta legal. I'm not referring to Zuckerberg's meta. Meta legal rationale, justification for having the president being solely on leadership that's societally oriented, because then you've institutionalized at the charter level within the company via the leadership vision. It's not enough to have it just in the corporate mission, right? Because the corporate mission really, it's just not sufficient. And a lot of times it's focused on the industry or the products itself, whereas the leadership vision goes on in a web-like structure in terms of the society that Steve Jobs envisioned. It went beyond the mission of Apple. And that societal reference point or anchor is legally then would be tied to the fact that the corporation has a state or a government charter. Just like the colonies had.
That's very interesting.
That's where they began. Charters from the king, Virginia, right? Where you are. Charter from the king. And it was a public, Virginia was not just a private company. They called it the Virginia Plantation, but there was a public function, and that people don't think. We get so focused on management, on strategic management and products, that we miss the big picture on what corporations really are based.
That is interesting. I like that, as far as being tying that vision to and that leadership function to the public charter.
Yes.
Yeah, because you're right. Every corporation, if you're a legal corporation, you've got to go to the state corporation commission and put in your filings and your annual reports. And they're definitely giving you the permission. Now, like I said, it's that and that creates the separate organization from you as a sole proprietor, and that bit of distance as far as from the legality aspect.
So then, circling back, we're reforming the corporation. Government governance, corporate governance, and leadership. Then at the macro level, in terms of the industry, then we'd say it'd be the role of government to apply antitrust when it's no longer competitive. That would imply campaign finance reform in terms of, I don't think we can take money out of politics, but it's a challenge. Is there a way that we can make the state governments and the federal government in the United States, and maybe the EU and Europe, less subservient to large concentrations of private wealth? In other words, large wealthy billionaires and corporations. Is there a way to do that without having utopian fantasy that all of a sudden we're going to wave a wand and money's not going to make any difference? Yeah. How do we play off self-interest against self-interest in government?
Yeah.
Which is
as long as TV stations charge for their advertising.
Some things we could look at is, again, they have charters. The charter for being able to profit by what is essentially a public function, and that really is a public function, the airwaves. Then
very true.
They need to not charge for political advertising.
Yeah, you give hours to this side, same amount of hours to that side. So much in prime time.
It's a mistake to subsume campaigns into capitalism. I don't think capitalism works for campaigns because of the plutocracy, over democracy.
Well, it definitely, and I guess it really doesn't matter which congressman it is, but basically it's one of the congressmen I was watching an interview several years back. They're like, if you don't have at least $1.5 million, $2 million running for a congressional seat.
Right.
And I was like, are you kidding? Like knowing he said, yeah, if you don't, unless it's just a completely, you're Democrat running in a blue, D plus 67 and a R plus 67 district. He said, unless that's the case, he said, let's just say 2 million in a competitive district. He said, don't even think about, just don't even file. Don't even try it.
So I don't think
it blew me away.
Right. So I don't think it's an accident that we haven't heard any side about breaking up the large meat producers, storage chains like Kroger, like Albertsons. We haven't heard a bit about that.
Matter of fact, I just believed, wasn't there just a Kroger and another one just what's the other one begins with an A? Anyway, they just merged.
Yeah.
They just got
absolutely astounding.
They just recently
for a competitive market, those prices would have gone down after the supply shocks of the pandemic. They would have gone down in 2022. And the fact that they didn't tells you that it's an oligopoly.
Yeah. But the biggest thing I think is look at the margins. Look at the margins, not just the amount of they made X number of profit. Okay, cool, but what's their margin? Because if they got a low margin, okay, because labor went up tremendously, and energy may come down, but labor is never going to come down. You're never going to have somebody making $15 an hour now that was making $7.50 an hour in 2018.
Right.
That 15 to 20 is never going back down to $7.50. It won't. You could get gas down to 85 cents a gallon.
Right.
that labor cost is never going to go down. So if you've got an industry, and I'll pick on the grocery store industry, and then we'll wrap up. But let's just say the grocery store industry was running at a historical average of 1.8, 2%, 2% margin. Well, after all the supply crunch went away, if they're now running a 15% margin instead of a 2%, where historically they've been 2%, yeah, no cool. But if they're if they're 1.8, 2.2, whatever, they're still in that kind of
no, their
roughly
margins
2%.
went way up. Their margins,
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. You got to look at the margins, right? How
right.
much did the margin go up? And that's kind of my point. It doesn't matter if it's from 2% to 15%, or if it's 2 to 5, maybe. But if it ballooned from 3% to 20%, yeah, that's a whole different ball game, and that's when you really need to start scrutinizing. Okay, where's the cost increase because of everything I'm getting in the value chain before it gets to the shelf has gone up, just like a value added tax in Europe, right? Every time it touches another set of hands, they get their tax, but every time it touches another set of hands, the price goes up. At what point is it? All right, we're just passing along what we're getting from the total length of the value chain, or how much is it? That hasn't changed, and it's our margins. That's really, I think, the place to look. And I think if the margins have just skyrocketed, then that's really something that deserves a lot more scrutiny. So, with that, tell our listeners how they can connect with you.
Yes.
Books, website, your blog, LinkedIn, everything. How can they? Where can they get in touch with you, and what kind of resources would you like to direct them to?
Well, I've since 2009, I have published essays at the Worden Report, Worden Report.
Okay.
And at Blogspot, and I have 1,756, maybe 60 essays on there.
Wow.
1,760 now, and then I have links to the 10 books and the 5 booklets and then academic articles. I write on religion, political economy, business and government, business ethics, higher education, and film, and leadership. Can't forget that one. And then, so they can reach me on there, and I'm on LinkedIn as well.
Okay. Well, sounds great. Well, we will have the
I'm
links.
on Facebook too, but it's kind of funny.
Not to say, let's just say most of our listeners, the Facebook isn't the biggest one compared to like LinkedIn or some of the other YouTube or some of the other ones. But so we'll put the links to your books and the Worden Report and your LinkedIn, and we'll put that in the description of the podcast. And so we'll have that resource available to everybody. I'll get that from you afterwards. So with that, we're going to wrap up this episode of Conversations on Leadership with Dr. Dave. Thank you again, Skip, for being here.
You're welcome.
And we will see you all. Yes, it was definitely been a pleasure. We will see you all next time. Take care.